Australia's Labour Prime Minister, John Curtin.
I'm happy to be back in Australia. I've seen many things and many places. And although every man can be forgiven for loving his own country best, I believe it is an impartial assessment of the facts to say that I have not seen any country or any people better than my own.
Welcome to Curtin's Cast, the John Curtin Research Centre's podcast, brought to you by myself, Nick Dyrenfirth, and Redbridge's Cos Samaras. Each fortnight, we bring you the freshest and most challenging conversations with leaders, activists, and thinkers from the world of Australian and global politics, culture, and ideas. G'day, Nick Dyrenfirth, Executive Director of the John Curtin Research Centre, and welcome to the first episode of Curtin's Cast, hosted by myself and Cos Samaras, Director of Redbridge Group. Today, it's just Cos and I chewing the fat on our lonesome. Welcome, Cos.
G'day, how are we?
Good, mate. Now, this is your favourite time of the year. This is your Christmas. They've all come at once. We've got polls coming in from left, right and centre, and particularly in the aftermath of the Werribee by-election, the duo of by-elections, state by-elections here in Victoria. YouGov popped out yesterday showing the coalition in front, or best place to form government. We had Newspoll hit inboxes and front page news today, again with the coalition in front. And of course, Redbridge had exclusive polling appearing in News Corp tabloids, Herald Sun, Daily Telegraph, Courier Mail. So what are the polls telling us, mate? It seems to be there's a pretty clear trend lines at play, but why don't you break it down?
Yeah, let's focus on the polls first, right? I mean, what you're seeing also in the polling, I'll say, arena is a range of different products out there trying to explain what the political landscape looks like. And the reason I think that is occurring, it's one of the reasons we are diversifying in how we measure the electorate, is because we are now living through a very different political paradigm. Both major political parties are going to struggle to get to 76 seats, right? So a nationwide poll, which was historically the best diagnostic tool, is not necessarily the best tool right now, because the coalition could be on 51 and still lose. Labor could end up on 48 and still be able to form a minority government. So what we need to know is where are the seats that count and who's winning them. And that's why I think some mixture of MRPs, we're doing a key seats track, which major political parties do during election campaigns.
This is Australia first, am I right?
Yes. For public consumption, yes. Usually, this is the sort of polling exercise that the major political parties roll out internally, and they keep a track on key seats. Now, not every key seat's on that list, because you don't need to have every key seat. You just need to have, key seats that are demographically and politically aligned to a group of electorates which you're worried about. And of course, last year we've done a number of MRPs as well. And so we've got a pretty clear picture. Both major parties, they're struggling to get to 76. And I think that will remain the case until the end of the campaign.
These national TPP votes, and I think the pulses have actually been moving in this direction, so we should totally ignore them, or do they still provide some kind of insight?
Yeah, they provide you some sort of insight. So, for example, if you're watching these nationwide polls over a period of 6 months, and there's a trend, you can kind of work out, okay, Labor's primary has been slowly eroding now for the last 2 years. There was a quick decline, and now just a very steady incremental drop. Okay, so where is that happening? That's when we bring in the more detailed analysis, right? So you need both to have a really good look at it. Both have their purpose, but both are now needed. You can't just rely on one.
Sure. Let's deep dive into the Redbridge polling. As you said, you're tracking voter shifts between now and election day. Election day is looking like May across 20 marginal seats. And you're right, it's mirroring what the majors are already doing out in the field.
That's right.
It's not great news for Elbow, but it's not great news for Peter Dutton, the opposition leader, is it? As you explained, a third of all voters in those 20 key seats, only a third think the government has the right priorities, and half of Labor voters are still open to changing their minds. So that's what you call the soft Labor votes, and it's concerningly high at the moment, isn't it?
Well, that's to me the first sign of a much more deeper structural problem that Labor is facing. We're talking about 30% of the electorate that are reporting to us the plan to vote for the Labor Party is 33%, a third. That's rock bottom, right? So you would expect that to be quite solid as a vote. So all the soft votes are gone. Everyone that's basically a swinging voter has jumped off. You would not expect to see half of that being soft. So this is where we are now reaching a different phase of Labor's history, where its base is going from a transformative period, where more people who have a university degree and live in the inner parts of our large cities are more inclined to vote Labor, and less people are inclined to vote Labor who have got a trades qualification or work in the precariat economy, work for small businesses, employees, low-income earners with an insecure work in our outer urban areas and the regions across the country.
And I want to really deep dive. We'll be diving deep into the Mariana Trench to talk about, this class realignment that we're seeing across the world. But I want to come to that in a moment because we're seeing it everywhere. And I know you're probably going to name check Thomas Piketty and your Bible.
That is my Bible.
The Brahmins and the merchant class. I don't have a Bible as a prop, but we're going to get to that moment. So, a question about the coalition, the Libs and Peter Dutton. Should they be doing better? So, from what I can work out, it's around across the polls, probably averaging out sort of 51 to 49 to Peter Dutton.
That's right.
But given some of the government's struggles, particularly around communication about what it's actually got done, why it should be re-elected, is there a valid argument to be made that the coalition should be further in front at this point in the cycle?
Yeah, I think we need to go back to 2022 to see what we're seeing today, right? So in 2022, Morrison government lost mainly because of two major reasons. The first one was Palmer United Party. A lot of attention's been paid to UAP because of the damage it did to Labor in 2019. In 2022, most of that damage was done on the coalition. So a lot of the coalition's primary votes splintered into the right flank. Labor didn't really pick up much of the coalition primary in seats that they actually secured. It was largely a product of coalition vote attrition. The other component to it, of course, was the Teal independence and obviously that the decoupling of the historic inner urban wealthy constituencies that the Liberal Party once upon a time used to define as safe. So that's a much more of a broader conversation around that realignment that we've been talking about. So what's going on now? Dutton has brought back his right flank. It's a consolidation of the Conservative vote. That's why it's only sitting on
One Nation.
That's right. Yeah. It's why it's sitting on about 40%, and it has not gone beyond that. Labor's back down to the low 30s, where it pretty much finished off in 2022, with a far more fragmented base because of that 30%, we can get into the weeds if you want, but in and amongst that base are a whole range of constituencies which are less loyal to the Labor brand than, for example, their parents may have been. So we're back to square one, and we're still going to see in excess of 5.2 million Australians vote for something other than the major parties at this coming election.
Yeah, so I wrote a piece, as you saw in the West Australian and reproduced in the Nightly about what Dutton's getting right and what he's not getting right. And my view is he's learnt many of the wrong lessons from Trump and Trump's success in appealing to working class punters in the States and confusing the noise around the Democrats and the left's so-called woke agenda and these attacks on diversity, equality and inclusiveness streams of government spending.
He's got to be careful there.
He's got to be careful. And, the polls are showing that he's not actually. So he's pulling back some of the base, but if he's actually not picking off people from the mainstream. And I actually call these mainstream the left conservative mainstream. They're quite fine with sort of mainstream social democratic economic thinking that, there is a role for government, and beyond, providing for a robust welfare state and, doing things around infrastructure, nation building, particularly at a federal government. And of course, all the things we've come to associate with state governments, basic service provision. But they are more cautious on social and cultural issues. And he doesn't seem to be making headlines there. So I just wanted to, why is that? I made the argument that I think Dutton's actually quite uncomfortable talking about the economy. His treasurer, Angus Taylor, I don't think many Australians could, if they had sent a series of mugshots, I don't think they could pick him out.
No, they wouldn't know.
They wouldn't know who he is. He's got very low profile.
Yep.
So he's in witness protection. Dutton doesn't like talking about the economy. Very, very comfortable on national security, law and order. And I know that your polling's picked up that federally speaking, all of a sudden we've got law and order is actually becoming a national issue. So they're not quite hitting the mark with economics. The nuclear, big bang nuclear policy that came, went, it's still thereabouts. And the other issue, which I don't think they're quite tapping into or hitting a weakness of federal Labor's, is housing. And again, my thesis is the Liberals haven't come to grips with the fact that the housing crisis, the national housing crisis, it has its roots in the early 2000s. So this happened under their acolyte John Howard's watch. That's when the rot set in. And until they get to grips with that, and we don't have the likes of sort of Senator Bragg out there, talking about crazy policies such as dipping into superannuation balances to put down a deposit. Until they come to grips with that, they're not going to make the sort of headway that they should be making on this barbecue stopper issue.
I think they need to come to grips with something a bit more I would say, significant for them as a political movement. So if they're serious about winning those outer suburban areas, winning seats which historically they've never been competitive in, they're going to have to break a few rules in their reason for existing as a political movement. They're going to have to abandon their aggressive industrial relations agenda.
Yeah.
They're going to have to, if they're going to become pro-worker, when I say pro-worker, not in the sort of union sense, but, pro-small business employee, pro-gig workers, if they're going to represent those people, they're going to have to abandon the institutional, I would say, powers which they have protected as a political movement for decades. Now, I know some in the Liberal Party are thinking like this, but that's a pretty significant transformation, right? And I don't think they're anywhere near pulling that off. And when you can see the evidence of what happens when you don't, the electorate knows. So the Werribee by-election, Labor had its base completely annihilated and it didn't go to the coalition. Why? Well, these disaffected low-income, middle-income, outer urban residents in that part of Melbourne took one look at the Liberal Party and thought, you're actually probably worse. So I'm going to vote for these other minor parties.
Yeah, because in terms of, breaking with, not singing from the hymn sheet of big business, I think you're right. And there are people like John Roscombe from the IPA who've made this argument. I think John's pretty uneasy. John's a great bloke, by the way, but I think John's talking the talk. I don't think we're going to see him walking the walk. But Dutton's got to kind of move there a little bit. But again, it's around sort of culture stuff. And you wrote an article, the Australian Financial Review, around woke capitalism. So Dutton's very comfortable whacking woolies on the head about, make-believe cessation of bans on selling Australia Day merchandise.
But is he comfortable in pushing for, I would say, a policy agenda to force woolies to do X, Y, and Z with regards to treating their customers a lot more fairly,
and their staff,
and their workforce, right? We haven't seen that, right? And that's fundamentally, if you're going to go the full Trump.
Yeah, the day Peter Dutton or another Liberal minister, I've seen Andrew Hastie on the back of an AWU truck out west.
He's the future.
That's scary for Labor.
He's the future.
So, Woolies were obviously recently engaged in an industrial dispute with their distribution, one of the distribution centres out in Melbourne's southeast. Libs silent. So
I was actually saying during that dispute that I was wondering if the Liberal leadership was going to come in on side of the workers. That would have been a seismic moment and would have shown us all that they're serious about winning these outer urban electorates. So although Albanese and the Labor Party got a lot of problems with its historic base, and we can talk about the problems are a product of many things, self-inflicted, but also undercurrents that are global.
Yeah. So let's talk about this global. I've used the terrible wonky phrase class realignment. Do you want to explain to people what do we mean when we're talking about class realignment, and where are we seeing its effects most pronounced?
Yeah, without giving everyone a long political history.
Yeah, you don't need to read Piketty. It's wasted in about 1,200 words.
That's right.
I didn't get through the whole thing.
That's right. That's right. So look, it's more about the parties of the left of the 20th century grew and prospered largely because they represented an emerging class of voter who were franchised. Now, in some countries like the UK, that the ability of certain classes to be able to vote didn't really come online until the 20s, right? But in other countries, it was a bit earlier, right? And so working classes, we like to use the term back in the 20th century, actually meant, working class. You worked with your hands, you worked in a factory, you on the tools. And
you lived and worked and socialised in the same suburb.
Absolutely correct. You were defined by your work.
Yeah.
You're
a union member.
That's right. And your identity was your work. That was what it meant to be working class in the 20th century, and you were extremely loyal to the parties of the left. Now, whether you were in Germany, whether in the UK, even in the US with the Democrats, obviously in Australia, that has for some time start to evolve as people's work and lifestyle changes. Obviously, because of the opening up of our economies, most of that heavy industry has been moved offshore and leaving behind an economy that was only really here to employ a particular type of person. So we became a knowledge economy in some states, service industries and so on. But if you were low income, you largely went into the precarious workforce, gig work, driving trucks, or you became a tradie, or you clean floors, right? Or you stack shelves. Your work no longer defines you. It's no longer something that you go home and say, I am a X, right?
And of course, this is a decades-long process.
That's right.
It's also about the feminisation of the working class as well.
Absolutely.
So, the working class that we're talking about, very masculine, very blokey, centered around, the male breadwinner, heading up the, family unit. Family's more complex these days, and women's place was, at home. But that's for the past 50 or 60 years, that's been breaking down.
Yes. Well, if you think about what Labor's base is today, it's public sector, female.
Yeah.
Right?
Classic, the model, the archetypal unionist today is a female nurse.
Absolutely. They're the powerhouse of unionism in the country.
Yeah.
Whenever I see media reports about unionism and it's portrayed with, the usual images get rolled out, which is, men in high vis, it's not exactly what union is.
I think that's part of Penn Dutton's mental problem as well, and the coalition's mental problem as well. Yeah. They've got when they think of unions,
that's right.
They think of the CFMEU.
Yeah.
They think of construction unions.
It's actually nurses and teachers.
It's not.
Nurses and teachers.
They're up for grabs. That's for grabs. We're seeing this class of realignment play out in the UK. The Tories smashed through Labor's red wall in 2019. Right. Jeremy Corbyn sort of basically opened up the red wall and sort of ushered them through. Starmer, even though they polled really badly at last election, won most of those seats back. Trump, of course, has appealed to these people across Europe. French socialists dead.
Yep.
Your country of sort of origin, PASOK,
gone.
Socialist, dead. Israel, Labour, Voda, dead. and it's happening, through it. And Germany, we've got an SPD government at the moment, but that's collapsing as well.
That's
so
right.
the base is fracturing, it's collapsing across the board. One particular thing I wanted to focus in on is, and what we're seeing on the flip side, so the votes of working class people are up for grabs, and they're drifting off to mainstream conservatism, or these what we might call
populist
options. Some of my friends hate describing these parties as populists. They go, "What's wrong with populism?"
Well, that's what the purpose of being elected is.
That's the purpose of being elected. So I kind of like anti-establishment. I think that actually captures what they're doing.
That's what they're doing.
And on some grounds it's economic. The pitch is against elite economic policy wonks and politicians who've overseen over the last 3 or 4 decades across the Western world, including Australia, the marketisation of society, privatisation of government assets, and this whole neoliberal framework. But on the flip side, we're seeing the progressive, university-educated middle class, this Brahmin class, professional managerial class, knowledge class, whatever you want to call it, they're starting to migrate to the parties of the left, where, historically...
that migration's completed now, in my opinion. Yes, absolutely. If you look at, in this country alone, Labor at the last election won seats like Higgins. It won seats like Bennelong, Reid. Its main gains on the East Coast were middle-class professional constituencies. This is where Labor did really well. Where did Labor find itself in hot water in 2022? At a time when they were winning, outer suburban. So if you look at Melbourne in particular, outer suburban Melbourne swung against Labor. It was ignored because, of course, Albanese was standing up there that election night claiming victory, right? People, when you win, you tend to not look at vulnerabilities that may have emerged out of a particular ballot. Being a former party official, that's what I did even when I won, right? Always look what lessons can we take out of this win that could actually potentially come back and bite us on the backside.
The sound lesson. And so it's a problem for both sides of politics, but it's more of an existential identity crisis for Labor, because guess what? The name of the clue is the name of the party, LABOR. And if that's not your base, well, what are you in political life for? But I wanted to drill down into that particular topic. There's a problem. Labor and like parties across the world have a particular problem with working class men, and we're doing some work together.
Yes, we are
around this theme, and they're particularly
young men.
Young men, they're particularly attracted to this anti-establishment, populist, right-wing.
Well, they're right-wing at the moment.
It's called a vibe shift.
Yeah, but they're right-wing at the moment, but I wouldn't rule out they could be left-wing, right? You can be populist, but the problem we have globally right now across Western democracies is that there isn't a left-wing option. I'm firmly of the belief that these same young working-class men would gravitate to a left-wing populist if one did exist. The problem is...
But economics is key, isn't it?
Economics is key.
And this is Trump's actually... People have misread Trump.
Yeah.
That's my argument, at least. Using tariffs as industry policy.
Well, it's music to working class ears.
I know. You'd love to... You turn the music to their ears.
That's right. I mean, the thing that Trump does well is he plays this mix of really, really nasty social conservatism, which we've seen in terms of, some of the issues around diversity, but at the same time, quite what I would define as left-wing when it comes to his economics, tariffs being one. Now, a lot of economists will tell you, tariffs inevitably will hurt the working class person or the low-income constituencies. Sure. But what if we say to these economists, you forget one thing, they don't believe your rhetoric because they're hurting right now. So how worse will their lives be?
Yeah. Gender cuts both ways. They're actually saying women who have historically supported the conservative side of politics in Australia, now they're migrating the other way.
Some women.
To what we might call the progressive side. Some women.
Professional women.
Yeah.
And young women in general. So, women in their 20s overwhelmingly in this country, irrespective of where they live, are leaning towards the left. But if we go to then,
Why is that? Why is that?
well, that's a long conversation, right? Around who were the. I mean, was it the pandemic? We know that when the pandemic hit, lockdowns took place. The a particular group of Australians were hit the hardest, and they were young women, right?
Yeah.
Is it some of the gender issues that they're facing in their own society? Online in particular, because their ecosystem is not like you and I when we were growing up, or our sisters out there, in terms of our age. But I would say that if you were to then go out to the outer urban areas and the regions of the country and you speak to women in their 30s with kids in their 40s, they're going to the conservative side. So there's a difference. There is some nuance here.
Yeah.
And Dutton is beginning to pick some of these women up in very significant numbers.
So talking about the young, so one of the fascinating things to keep a look at, I think, this year is the performance of the Greens. They have been polling very strongly amongst young people, broadly defined, going hard on climate change, the environment, tapping into anxiety around the housing market, and particularly appealing to renters. Max Chandler Mather, whatever you think about him, has got a public profile. They're tapping into this angst, but have they hit a ceiling? You've had some really interesting data looking at their votes since the October 7 attacks by Hamas against Israel. And the Greens have taken a very strong position from the outset. Some would say a very extreme position. But you've been doing some tracking around those polls and how the Greens are tracking with those sort of younger progressive voters, particularly in the inner city seats. And I'm interested in your view on how their stance on those issues has played out, particularly with women who, as we said, are migrating to that sort of politics.
Up until that period, October 7, one could easily say that the momentum for the Greens was quite substantial. We saw that obviously manifest in 2022, the federal election. They won 3 federal electorates in Brisbane. If you and I were talking 10 years ago and we mentioned to each other that the Greens will be occupying 3 electorates in Brisbane, we'd laugh. Well, here we are, right? They won 3 seats. Their vote went up across the country. They looked like genuinely a political movement that was on the rise. October 7 comes along, their subsequent policy response to that. And I would say not just that, but also an escalation of their activities against the Albanese government. When I say,
I was going to ask you the blocking role.
Blocking
role.
So what they failed to understand, or what they've actually misread in terms of their support, is that Greens voters are not Greens activists.
Yeah.
Greens voters.
That's a lesson all parties need to learn.
Absolutely.
But I think particularly Greens.
Yeah. Greens voters vote Green because Labor is not progressive enough on a whole number of issues, particularly climate, but also there's a whole range of other issues that are really, really important to them, that they think Labor is too moderate and conservative. But they still want Labor to beat the coalition. The problem the Greens confronted was they developed a brand that they were part of a machine that was grinding down the Albanese government so Dutton can win. And so older millennial voters, particularly in the East Coast, started to jump off them and go on to Labor. And we saw that express itself at the ballot box, at the New South Wales local government elections last year, at the ACT elections where they lost seats to the Teals, at the Queensland state election. Again, very similar patterns. Victorian
left with 1 seat in the Queensland State Parliament.
That's right. They actually lost ground. And then, of course, the Victorian local government elections where they were completely decimated in their strongholds.
Yeah, wiped out inner southeast.
That's right. Correct.
That's
right.
People think about the inner north being their kind of
Paran by-election comes along.
Yeah.
And, Labor doesn't stand.
So Tony Lupton stands up.
That's fine, but the Greens' response to that was, Labor not standing helped the coalition. Well, hang on a minute. Shouldn't Labor voters just vote for you? If you were moderate enough or you were constructive enough in the political discourse out there, the Greens should have easily gotten to 43%, which was the magic number they needed, right? But instead, they stayed at 36.
And there were a lot of wild excuses offered up in the in the aftermath, including that young people are away on holiday. They hadn't returned to university.
Yeah.
That's the first one I've heard.
That's interesting. It's probably as good as their backpacker narrative back in, I think it was the Melbourne by-election 2011, which they lost to Labor, where it was because a lot of their voters were backpacking at the time.
Yeah, well, that's their problem. It's not up to us to offer them free advice. But how do you think that? I mean, we making predictions is a fool's errand. But do you think they'll tread water at the next election? Will they go backwards in the House of Representatives? My gut feeling is they might go backwards. I mean, I think Adam Bant's Citadel of Melbourne. It's just that
it's fine.
It's a citadel.
Yeah.
But will they take a seat like Wills, which I think would be
it's
a tragedy for Labor because Peter Khalil is one of the smartest, most thoughtful and humane.
Flip side, you
MPs.
could argue that Samantha Ratner is also, a very talented, politician on the green side of politics. I think that yes, they'd still, I would say, are in a very, very competitive environment when it comes to Wills. I would say they'll hold on to the federal seat of Griffiths. Ryan, who knows? Brisbane's a three-way contest. Any one of the three could win it. So the LNP, Labor and the Greens, it's such a difficult seat to predict and to actually research as well. So I think they'll stay where they are. They might lose one and gain one, but I think it's going to be status quo in and around that space.
Because you could make a good politician. You hedged your bets there.
It's a Pulse's answer, mate.
And Teals, where do you think they'll go? So similar social, similar class demographics dynamics at play there.
All the data that we've seen to date suggests that they are going to be re-elected and comfortably re-elected in most of the seats they gained in 2022, with the exception of probably Curtin and, of course, Goldstein. Curtin, because it was the lowest primary that an independent secured at that last election and won the seat. And, of course, Goldstein because of that Middle Eastern conflict that we've touched on.
Yeah.
Where we do know that the Jewish community, irrespective of their voting patterns of history, many of them would have voted for Teal and Greens and so on, are now voting in a very significant way for the coalition.
Which brings us back to the point: have they cut off their nose to spite their face?
Who?
In terms of the Greens, this relentless focus on claiming a seat like Wills, this relentless activism, this position on the Israel-Hamas conflict. So they might win a seat like Wills, but is that at the cost of crueling their chances elsewhere? I think it's Samara and elsewhere for a generation.
Possibly, but I wouldn't say for a generation. I'd say this is probably a temporary pause in their history, in their growth.
Yeah, because they've got they are it's a self-conscious class now. This knowledge class.
That's right.
They have an identity. They have a Greens identity.
That's right, and I would say that there are still very strong numbers coming through them for them amongst Gen Z. So very, very strong numbers.
Now, I heard you mention Curtin before, the seat of Curtin in Perth, and I did want to ask you about Western Australia. We were chatting
Billionaire Central
before.
The federal seat of Curtin. Did you know it's got the highest number of billionaires?
Really?
Yes.
I didn't know that particular data. We love Cos and his data here and his graphs. I don't know if we're not going to see a graph.
We're going to see a graph today.
Podcast. We're not going to see it today. I'm probably not going to see it
That's right.
over 2025. But WA. So how does the fact that Western Australians, sandgropers, so that's a blast from a past nickname for our Western Australian listeners. How does WA going to an state election this year and before the Club Fed, how will that impact the federal election? How is WA looking overall?
WA is looking very good for Labor. And look, in Western Australia is very similar to South Australia. And they are two states that we go back to that conversation we're having about the traditional working class decoupling from the parties of the left and, Labor's base becoming more of a service class. Well, if you look at the histories of those two states, they've had the lowest number of people in traditional manufacturing industries. Yes, they've got a mining industry, but that's relatively small, FIFO workers. Overwhelmingly, it's that, that educated middle-class constituency that has been moving to the Labor over the last 10 years in particular. And where is it at disproportionately the most advantageous for Labor? Western Australia, right? And so what we are seeing is, yes, a bit of that, but also obviously what Morrison did to the Liberal brand in that state during lockdowns clearly, burnt their brand to the ground, and the Liberal Party has not recovered since. So I think Labor's going to have a really good day at both state and federal elections.
Interesting, very interesting. Yeah, Premier Cook looks the goods. And I'm interested that you mentioned Morrison. I mean, Morrison, deeply unpopular in Victoria, deeply unpopular, often regarded as the Prime Minister for City. And in fact, whether it's Tony Abbott, Malcolm Turnbull or Scott Morrison, all regarded as, and to a greater or lesser extent, Prime Ministers for Sydney. But Victoria looks like, perhaps the most interesting result since 1990.
Yes.
Now, that's going way, way back in the time machine, before many of our listeners are actually born.
That's right.
But 1990, if you want to
we were children back then, Nick.
I was a child. I wasn't even a teenager. So there you go.
There you go.
People get it. People know how old I am now. But 1990 was the Labor was whacked in Victoria. Are we going to see a repeat?
Yes. Yeah, we will see a repeat of, I wouldn't say necessarily this that amount of seats changing, but definitely that level of volatility. And we got a preview of that to where we by-election. Yes, it's a state by-election, et cetera, et cetera. But what that by-election does show us is the extent of the discontent in the electorate. Right?
Yeah, so what's driving that? So I think, we're seeing this at the meta level, this class realignment.
Yeah.
And I was actually really interested. John Howard, I watched his podcast that he did with John Anderson, who was Deputy Prime Minister under Howard's watch. And Howard said we're moving to, traditionally, the major parties have won 40% each, 45% each, and then 10 to 20% vote other. Now, Howard, of all people, says we're in this 30, 40 worlds. And that seems to have come through in Werribee.
Yeah, absolutely. But if you want to know where is the epicenter in this country of the paradigm that we've been talking about, that realignment, it's Victoria.
Yeah.
A long history of manufacturing. Western suburbs of Melbourne historically was blue collar to the bone. Western suburbs of Melbourne now, the main employer is probably small business, right? And people on ABNs driving trucks,
yeah,
right, and cleaning, and in the care services economy.
So some of this is long-term structural and cultural
Absolutely,
stuff.
that's right.
But how does
there's something else that happened.
There's pandemic, and we've got
pandemic's a pretty big one. We cannot ignore what happened to these people during the pandemic. And if you're in another part of the country, it's hard to wrap your head around this. But the economic impact on these communities in the west and northwest of Melbourne in particular, but also the outer southeast, is as severe as, I would say, the early 1990s recession.
Yeah, talk about one of the big points you've been on about is have a look at the food banks. If you want to know how tough people are doing, look at the food banks.
Victoria's now got the highest number of insolvencies.
Yeah.
It's got the highest proportional number of people seeking food assistance. The pandemic knocked these people out economically. Then we had 12 interest rate rises. And then we also had a Labor government at a state level that locked them down, came out of the pandemic, and then said, thank you very much, see you later. We're going to go back to basically doing what we've always done. We're going to pour billions into marginal seats. We're going to pour billions into seats that we need to win. And, we'll throw a couple of Band-Aids towards you just to make sure that you think we're not ignoring you. That shock those communities experienced. And we cannot overestimate this enough, how impactful that pandemic was. Then the inflationary crisis sped up that decoupling that we've been talking about. There's only one catch to all of this, though, is these people are not convinced the coalition's the answer.
Yeah.
Right? So they're just sitting there in the departure lounge at the moment.
So how does the coalition seal the deal?
As we touched on before.
Is it policies? This is a sort of theoretical conversation that we've had is how much do policies matter? How much do campaigns matter? Or people's votes baked in? What sort of policies should the coalition and Labor, for that matter, be offering up to mainstream Australia?
Have a look at the way the two campaigns are being run at the moment. You'd swear nothing's changed since 2010, right? I mean, their approach is to promise this road, that road.
Labor's going big on health too.
That's right, yeah, but no one's paying attention.
Yeah,
like the voters that Labor's got problems with, and the coalition, in terms of grabbing their votes in these sort of areas that we've been touching on, out of Western Sydney, Western Melbourne. They're not in that media ecosystem, right? They're not reading mainstream legacy medias. They're consuming a different type of political content. Hours upon hours of YouTube content is being consumed every night by those in their 40s and 30s and 20s in this country.
Yeah.
And some of it's frivolous, some of it's quite serious, right? It's a mix. They're the most well-informed constituency, since our democracy.
Yeah, and it's something that, political insiders and activists from across the majors, Greens, whatever, need to get their head round.
Absolutely.
If they think that political discussions just happen on Insiders and on the ABC, they're dead wrong.
Wrong.
This is politics. Joe Rogan is where people get their political.
I've been following Joe Rogan now for 10 years. I've watched that evolution. And for those who are interested in why is Coz listening to Joe Rogan for 10 years, I've got a kickboxing background. So the fight game for me is a pastime, passion of mine. And so, I've watched that evolution and the popularity of that form of media, and so when Trump went on to Joe Rogan, I knew that was a game changer, absolute game changer. 3 hours of a relaxed conversation where Trump was able to portray himself as human, right? And there were moments of humility that he expressed, which you don't normally see, right? And that was a game changer. Absolute, cannot emphasize how bad that was for the Harris campaign.
Yeah, we actually hosted Chris Binns a fortnight ago in Sydney, discussion about housing, part of our Common Good series. And Chris was quite ebullient on the way in. He told me he'd just recorded a podcast with Dana White from...
There you go. Absolutely, right? Absolutely. And
you might want to explain who Dana White is.
Dana White's the head of the UFC.
Yeah.
Which is those who don't know who UFC is, cage fighting. There you go.
Yeah. Can I just advise listeners, Curtinistas, don't jump in the ring with Cosimo's. He may be a bit diminutive, but I'm going to give you some solid advice. Don't do it. So that's my framing. Framing leaders, Cos.
Yep.
How important will leaders be on the campaign trail? I've seen Peter Dutton. I was reading the News Corp papers over the weekend. What we call a soft profile in the Daily Telly and the Herald Sun, where he's been much more open to telling his story, telling his so-called log cabin story. I don't think he's really got a log cabin story to tell. I think the journo who wrote that up is a bit confused about what a log cabin actually means. JD Vance has a log cabin story, the US Vice President.
Definitely does.
How important are leaders going to be, and how are they getting their pitch right to the electorate? There's, 2022, I think, Albo got into office. Much of that was a rejection of Scott Morrison.
That's
deeply unpopular, seen as incompetent, particularly on the latter stage of the pandemic, rolling out the vaccines, etc. I don't know how to hold a hose, mate. Albo presented as cautious, small C conservative leader. In fact, I think described as being the Labor version of John Howard. But does that suit the politics of 2025? And he's led a cautious, incremental government, which has done big things. And part of the Labor's problem is they haven't been able to sort of tie all this stuff together.
Yeah.
Lots of stuff going on that hasn't been tied together as, this is the big picture. We're doing all this. You're getting your cheaper medicines. That's huge too, by the way.
It's very big.
Cheaper PBS medicines. we're doing this. We're reforming the RBA. We've tweaked the tax cuts. We've been doing all this like super impressive work around fixing up industrial relations loopholes. We've been doing work on housing, but it hasn't been brought together.
If you look at those policies, right, they are very, very good achievements.
Yeah.
But they touch very small numbers of people. And if you were to walk around the I would say the country and look at who's actually gettable as a vote, and then work out, does any of these policies cross over into them? Some, yes, some not. What the electorate is starving for is significant economic reform. They think the system is broken. You know, the sentiment that drove the election of Trump exists here in this country. The only reason we're not seeing a Trump-type personality succeed is it doesn't exist. And our Westminster system makes it really hard for that to occur, right? So the sentiment is there. People think the system's broken. They think it's stacked against them. They will applaud politicians who gang up on establishment, full stop, be it corporates, be it whatever you want. And they're not seeing that reform. And they're not seeing from both sides.
And it's hard to tell that story, isn't it?
Mm.
You know, we live in this fragmented media environment. Talked about the influence of Joe Rogan and podcasters and so-called influencers. It is harder to actually tell that big picture meta narrative story.
You see, where Trump succeeds in doing that is he takes on a few things which, of course, established political players don't want to go near to. Tariffs, for example. You know, most political thinkers in this country wouldn't want to go near it because they think it's, you know, going to be economically bad for certain constituencies. Well, you know, some will argue that the removal of the 5% import tariff from Japanese cars to Australia in 2013, which of course Abbott signed, was the death knell to our automotive industry. Now, our automotive industry had a number of problems. Speak to most individuals who worked in that industry, and they'll tell you, they'll blame that free trade agreement, right? So again, you know, will you go back and reintroduce that 5%? Why not, right?
Why not?
5%, it's not 20.
Yeah. It's the vibe. So it's the vibe shift, shift. We're out of time because we could talk all day. We do normally talk most days.
We do.
But we will have to talk on a next installment of Curtin's Cast. Thank you very much, mate. I'm looking forward to 2025. Listeners, we have a really exciting year ahead. Lots of election material to talk through. Next up, all the way from the UK, we've got Lord Glasman, in fact, who'll be talking to us about the renaissance of Blue Labor and the mess that is UK politics, and other sensational guests, including Treasurer Jim Chalmers. But that is it for today. Stay tuned for Curtin's Cast. We'll catch you next time.